On the 5th of March 1966, passengers boarded a flight at Haneda Airport in Japan. As it pushed back from the gate, some of them looked uncomfortably out the windows. Some distance away, several runways were scattered with the smoking debris of a deadly commercial plane crash that had taken place the previous evening in dense fog. The sight was disquieting, a chilling reminder of the chaos that poor weather conditions can cause. But, though of course upset by the sight of the wreckage, nobody on board Flight 911 that day considered that they were at risk. The weather for their flight was perfect, and 2 plane crashes in 2 days was a vanishingly unlikely possibility. British Overseas Airways Corporation, or BOAC Flight 911, took a route that would be considered unusual by today's standards. Rather than flying from point to point, the flight followed an itinerary lasting more than a week, beginning in London and ending in Hong Kong, with intermediary stops in Montreal, San Francisco, Honolulu, and Tokyo. Some passengers would take the entire leisurely flight, while others would join for only 1 or 2 legs of the journey. After several days of uneventful travel, Flight 911 encountered difficulties on the 4th of March, 1966, the day that it was scheduled to land in Tokyo. Heavy fog over the city made landing at Haneda Airport impossible, and so the flight diverted to nearby Fukuoka Airport. The passengers on board for that leg of the flight might have been glad that it did. On that foggy evening, Canadian Pacific Airlines Flight 402, arriving from Hong Kong, had gone ahead with an attempted landing at Haneda during a brief window when conditions improved. Visibility was still very poor though, and as this plane approached the runway it struck a lighting rig and then crashed violently into the ground, killing 64 of the 72 people on board. By the next morning, the fog which caused this catastrophe had disappeared. In fact, conditions were unusually clear and bright with excellent visibility. Flight 911 took off from Fukuoka in the morning and landed in Tokyo around midday. After a quick turnaround and a refuel, it was ready to fly once more, heading to its final destination of Hong Kong. On board were 113 passengers and 11 crew, including 45-year-old Captain Bernard Dobson, 33-year-old First Officer Edward Maloney, 33-year-old Second Officer Terence Anderson, and 31-year-old Flight Engineer Ian Carter. Between them, the crew had more than 25,000 flight hours and more than 7,000 in Boeing 707s, the type of aircraft that they were flying that day. At 1:50 p.m., Flight 911 lined up and took off from Haneda. As it maneuvered, many of those on board would have had an excruciatingly clear view of the wreckage of the Pacific Airlines flight that had crashed the night before, which lay still smoking beside a runway. It might have been an upsetting sight, but there was no reason to believe that Flight 911 was at risk of a similar fate. Even in 1966, plane crashes were still very rare events, and the chances of 2 crashes taking place in 2 days in the vicinity of the same airport were astronomically remote. On top of that, the weather conditions that day were close to perfect. The sky was blue and clear, with barely any perceptible wind at ground level. Indeed, to take advantage of this beautiful weather, Captain Dobson sought a slight variation from the scheduled route. By passing close to the iconic Mount Fuji, he would be able to offer his passengers some spectacular aerial views, and perhaps take their minds off the sight of the wreck of the Pacific Airlines flight. Air traffic control quickly granted permission for this variation from the planned route. With conditions as they were, there was no known reason to deny the request. Some turbulence was expected in the vicinity of the mountain, but nothing that would be any cause for alarm. In fact, absolutely everything appeared normal for the first 15 minutes of the flight. Passengers peered out of windows and took photos of the breathtaking landscape below. The 707 soared through a perfectly blue sky away from a distant series of clouds. All was well. Everything was peaceful. And then, without warning, the plane disintegrated. The vertical stabilizer ripped away, followed by the engines. The fuselage broke apart. Luggage and bodies spilled into the clear blue sky. The wreckage tumbled towards the ground below, slamming into the earth with fatal force. The cockpit and some other parts of the wreckage caught fire upon impact with the ground. There were no survivors, and no immediate indication of what could possibly have gone wrong. The disaster claimed the lives of all 124 people on board the aircraft. Among the dead were 75 employees of the American corporation Thermo King, a business based in Minneapolis that had decided to reward its finest employees for that year with an all-expenses-paid trip across Asia. Many workers had been allowed to bring along their partners, with the end result that 63 children were orphaned by this single plane crash. In the immediate aftermath of the disaster, once it had been ascertained that there were no survivors, an urgent investigation began. The plane had been in excellent repair. The weather had been perfect. It was imperative that investigators determined what had gone wrong to prevent any further accidents. This required the painstaking examination of a debris field that stretched for 16 kilometers, or 10 miles, from the town of Gotemba up onto the slopes of Mount Fuji. Thousands of personal items and pieces of wreckage were recovered and forensically examined. Some fatigue cracks were found in metal components of the airplane, but after more testing it was determined that these had not contributed to the crash. Slowly, suspicion turned towards the mountain. It was well known that there could be turbulent air currents around Mount Fuji, even when the weather appeared perfectly clear. But these air currents had never previously crashed a commercial airliner. It did appear, however, that these air currents were dangerous. Could this be what had brought down Flight 911? Eventually, it was determined that strong winds over Mount Fuji had created a phenomenon known as a mountain wave. This is caused when air currents flowing over a large obstacle, like a mountain, are disrupted by said obstacle, turn back in on themselves, and form a powerful, fast-moving, circular current. Several of these in succession form a wave in the lee of a large mountain, a completely invisible area of devastating turbulence. Flight 911 had flown into this mountain wave. The pilots had been unable to see or detect it, and in 1966 the phenomena was not well enough understood for it to be included in pilot training or accounted for in flight plans. When asked to allow a deviation from the scheduled flight path to fly closer to Mount Fuji, air traffic controllers had known of no reason to say no. As it approached the mountain, Flight 911 had encountered a solid wall of wind that had smashed into it with incredible force. The sudden onslaught of turbulence had been so powerful that it may have instantly killed some passengers and crew before tearing the plane to pieces. The rear stabilizer had been ripped from the fuselage, followed by the engines. There had been no opportunity for the crew to save the plane, to avert disaster, or even to see the turbulence coming. The shocking nature of this crash, combined with the fact that it was the second Japan had seen in 24 hours, resulted in a massive drop in demand for commercial flights. The country's major airlines scaled back operations in the wake of the disaster, and it was many years before Japanese citizens regained confidence in their aviation industry. During that time, the dangers posed by the way wind interacts with mountains were studied extensively, and gradually came to be better understood. Now, flight paths typically avoid areas where this kind of turbulence is possible. The time when a flight might be granted permission to deviate from its route to offer passengers better views of a famous mountain are now long past. With the knowledge we now have, it is possible to avoid disasters like the loss of BOAC Flight 911. The disaster made us aware of an unknown unknown, and prompted us to better our understanding of a weather phenomenon that is potentially deadly. We now know that wind currents in the lee of a mountain can crash a plane. On that day in 1966, however, the sudden disintegration of Flight 911 would have taken the crew and the passengers by complete surprise. It was a disaster that came, quite literally, from a clear blue sky.